You write today's date without thinking. A number, a letter, done. You don't question it. Why would you? But that letter carries a decision made over 1,000 years ago by a monk who was mostly trying to solve a math problem about Easter. For most of human history, there was no shared date, no universal year zero. Every kingdom counted time from its own beginning. Rome counted from the founding of its city. Egypt counted from the reign of whichever pharaoh sat on the throne. Ask someone in the ancient world what year it was, and the answer depended entirely on where they stood. So, how did the whole world agree on one number? And why does that number split history into two directions, counting up on one side and down on the other? It starts with a monk named Dionysius Exiguus. In the year 525, living in Rome, he'd been asked to calculate the correct date for Easter, which depended on an old Roman dating system tied to a persecuting emperor named Diocletian. Dionysius didn't want to count sacred time using a tyrant's name. So he anchored the count to the birth of Jesus instead, calling the years Anno Domini, Latin for in the year of the Lord. That's where AD comes from. Not a scientific measurement, a monk's personal preference, buried in a technical church document. Here's the twist historians love to point out. Dionysius almost certainly got the date wrong. Most scholars now estimate Jesus was born somewhere between 6 and 4 BC, based on records about King Herod, who died around that time. The calendar's starting point has been off for 15 centuries. Nobody ever went back to fix it. For a while, almost nobody used the idea. It sat quietly in church records. The person who made it popular wasn't Dionysius. It was an English monk named Bede, writing 200 years later, around 731. Bede used Anno Domini throughout his history of the English church, and because his work spread across Europe, so did the dating system. Bede also extended the count backward, labeling years before Jesus' birth as before Christ. That's the origin of BC. Notice what that means. The calendar has no year zero. It jumps straight from 1 BC to AD 1. If you've ever tried to calculate someone's age across that boundary and the math fell off, that's not your mistake. The system was never built with a zero in it, because zero wasn't in common use in Western Europe when Dionysius made his calculation. Picture a merchant in 9th century England dating a land deed. He doesn't know he's using a monk's math error from 3 centuries earlier. He just writes the year the way everyone around him does, because Bede's book became the standard. Standard spread through habit, not decree. By the time European explorers and colonial powers spread across the globe from the 16th century onward, they carried this calendar with them. It wasn't adopted for being more accurate than other systems. The Islamic calendar and the Chinese calendar are just as precise internally. BC and AD spread because of who held power, who built the ports, who printed the maps. Here's the counterintuitive turn. As the world grew more connected and science and diplomacy needed one shared timeline, that timeline's explicitly religious label became a problem. A researcher in Tokyo and a historian in Delhi don't necessarily share the framework baked into before Christ. But everyone still needed the same number line. The fix wasn't to change the numbers. It was to rename them. BCE means before the Common Era. CE means Common Era. The year numbers don't move. 44 BC and 44 BC are the same year, only the label changed, stripped of the reference to Jesus, while quietly keeping his birth as the anchor anyway, because renumbering every historical record on Earth was never realistic. Even scholars who use BCE and CE to avoid religious framing are still counting from the same starting point of 6th century monk guessed at, and probably guess wrong. The label is neutral. The number underneath never stopped being religious in origin. You can see the shift in real institutions. Archaeology and anthropology journals moved toward BCE and CE through the late 20th century. Museums and university history departments followed, since their subject matter spans cultures with no connection to Christianity at all. Everyday use, calendars, casual conversation, most software, still runs on BC and AD, simply because that's what stuck first. So the notation splits along who's using it. Religious and cultural contexts tend to keep BC and AD. Academic and international contexts increasingly use BCE and CE. Neither is more correct mathematically. Same number line. Two labels, shaped by who needed the calendar to feel neutral. Think about that the next time you glance at a date. You're not reading a fact of nature, like a measurement of gravity. You're reading the residue of one monk's Easter calculation, one later monk's popular book, centuries of political reach, and a modern effort to strip out a religious label without touching the math underneath. Your phone, your passport, your birth certificate, all of them quietly assumed the specific chain of decisions was the right one to standardize on. Not because it was the most accurate system available, because it was the one that spread. So the next time you write today's date, remember what that number actually is. It's not a neutral fact you're recording. It's a monk's 1,500-year-old guess, still running, still slightly wrong, still the number the entire world quietly agreed to share.